Thank you very much. I was a little taken aback when people introduce me at conferences because I don't recognize myself sometimes. I've been on a long journey. I was a history teacher for many years, and then I've worked in initial teacher education, and I've been at Stirling for 24 years, a wonderful place to work. Nice countryside, great colleagues, lovely campus. And it's given me the opportunity to work in a field which has inspired me since I was a teacher, and I did a master's degree in the early 90s in curriculum studies, something that's actually quite difficult to do in the UK at the moment. Okay, so wanted to just reflect a little bit on the title and the picture here before I start. Diverse voices. I mean, in a sense, this work which I'm going to present today is only possible because of diverse voices. I've been a member of the ECER Network 3 curriculum for nearly 15 years now, and a lot of the work I'm going to talk about today is a collaborative effort. It builds upon the efforts of previous researchers. It's working with collaboration with great colleagues in the network, and I really do want to dedicate this keynote to those colleagues who I've worked with, particularly the people who have been involved most recently in our book, Curriculum Making in Europe. The picture on the front here of the oyster shell with the pearl, I think for me is an apt metaphor for thinking about how we develop education. There is a tendency, which I'm going to reflect on today, to silence or ignore dissenting voices. But like the grit in the oyster shell, those dissenting voices are what add richness and diversity to our education systems. And I would argue are absolutely necessary if we want to break free of a conformity, an orthodoxy which often afflicts education systems. I'm going to talk primarily today about the diverse voices in a professional domain, but while acknowledging that the voices of students, young people, and other students and community actors are really important as well in curriculum making, and I will refer from time to time to that. But I really want to focus on how, as a system, we build upon the professional voices, even when those voices are often in tension or conflict, in order to enrich and enhance the education systems that we're working with and to produce better curriculum making. So, let's start with a rather peculiar story, which was in the Times newspaper a while back, which is about silencing of critical voices. Now, this particular story is about a military intelligence officer who made some, I suppose, sarcastic comments in the media about new rules, and he was instantly, as he said, put on the naughty step. Now, the language is quite interesting here, isn't it? Because it implies that here's a child who's not doing as he's told. But actually, if you look at the picture here, perhaps we should be saying that the people who are refusing to listen to those dissenting voices are actually behaving in a way that might be described as childish, with the fingers and ears and so on. Now, of course, this isn't just in this one domain. There's some interesting stuff came out subsequently about education. An educator, Ruth Swales, was told that she was no longer welcome at an event organised by the DFE in England. And there was some talk of legal action. She was then subsequently allowed to attend, but her attendance could only be for 30 minutes. It had to be via conference call, not in person. She had to send her presentation for vetting beforehand. And this almost sounds like something that wouldn't be out of place in the totalitarian regime here. And the picture here is of an email trail, a Freedom of Information request. It uses the term here about bringing the department into disrepute. Now, this is quite astounding, really, isn't it? How on earth can someone who doesn't work for the department bring it into disrepute by offering a view on something, and particularly an informed expert view on education that just happens to differ from the orthodox view? So, moving on, Scotland, where we're located now, which is where I've been working, is ostensibly much better than this. We don't see this sort of, I think, overt cancel culture in Scotland in such the same sort of way. And if we have a look at the structure of the Scottish education governance, we can see, for example, that there are academic experts on some of the key government advisory boards. The Scottish Education Council is a body that advises the minister, that's chaired by the minister. There are advisory boards that sit under that, curriculum and assessment, teacher education, and academics are quite well represented on these boards. We've also got something called the Academic Reference Group for Educational Research, which meets regularly with the government as a focus group, as an interest group, to advise the government on educational research. And that comprises senior academics from all of the education departments in Scotland, and as well as independent researchers. And then there has been a raft of key publications, reports, reviews, which are about change, which ostensibly, again, are involving lots of academic input. So the Hayward Review had a group of people, including academics, but also some representation from the teaching profession. The Rapid Review of Qualifications, which I led, again, was about providing an independent report for the government. So this sounds really good. And then, of course, we've had the national discussion this year, which has been a huge exercise led by 2 independent academics to work out what matters in Scottish education to inform the reform agenda as it moves forward. So there is ostensibly, as I said, this commitment to seek the views of stakeholders, but I would argue here that these voices are not always heard. These are often seen as on-paper exercises. They subsequently lead to very little action. And I was talking to someone a couple of days ago who was saying that the OECD review, which was done of the Curriculum for Excellence a couple of years ago, has all it's led to is no action, but just more reviews. And the term unaction was used here. And the term consultation, well, my colleague and good friend Walter Humes talks about this. He says that it's no surprise that the word consultation begins with the word con, okay? And the word nonsultation has been used in this respect as well. So it's not quite as straightforward as it seems. There are structures which ensure collaboration and consultation, but what we're not seeing is actually perhaps the genuine surfacing of dissenting and alternative views. And Walter, of course, has written an awful lot about this. I just want to draw attention to this quotation here from a chapter he wrote recently. You know, decision-making is often slow. Bureaucratic organisations, and Scotland is a very bureaucratic top-down hierarchy, some seek to defend and sometimes extend their territory. We see a lot of turf wars here. Adept at using their narrative privilege to give positive accounts of their achievements and resist calls for major change. And one of the things that strikes me very much about working in Scotland is how organisations are set up to justify themselves. So this is not about genuinely critiquing what we do with a view to improving, but often saying, aren't we doing a good job? And I think that is a real problem as we're moving into a time of a significant reform agenda here. Senior members of the policy community tend to know each other, often attending the same meetings and revisiting the same issues. Again, Walter's written quite a bit about this, the revolving door in agencies where the same people are recycled between jobs and roles. And then he talks about the high level of conformity in Scotland. The members have learnt to go with the grain of current orthodoxies and avoid controversy. The aim is often to reach a comfortable consensus which does not encourage critical interrogation of official policies. A form of groupthink is evident in the recycling of approved forms of discourse. So within this, and there is this mythology, I think, of a consensus in Scottish education, voices are ignored, silenced often, actively. There are examples of teachers being taken to disciplinary action for expressing views on social media. And so, in a sense, Scotland isn't that much different to England. The current reforms are a good example of this. There were these education review boards were set up, delivery boards they were called. The main education one is 59 people, and only 3 of these are teachers. And of those 3, I think they were all head teachers. So there's a lack of representation, perhaps. And where teachers are represented, they tend to be from the professional associations, from the unions, rather than from the classroom. This was an article in the Scotsman newspaper by a guy who's a former head who's been very critical of the process. My experience actually is quite interesting to reflect briefly on here. Walter Humes and I wrote an article in 2010 called The Development of Scotland's Curriculum for Excellence, Amnesia and Deja Vu. And it didn't go down very well, it's fair to say. I was taken to one side by somebody fairly senior in the community who said I needed to watch myself. I had a senior civil servant told me, why should we listen to you when you're undermining policy? Now, I would argue again that my job is actually to critique policy, but these are the sorts of gut reactions you get when you produce something that's critical. Or another type of reaction here. We were commissioned to do some research for a national agency supporting teacher assessment the same year, and the findings were uncomfortable for the organisation. So we were informed that this particular publication would not be published, it would be kept for internal discussions only. So I'm painting a picture here of a system that's quite risk averse, that is resistant to dissenting voices, that's conservative with a small c, and where the status quo is preserved through the power structures and the cultures of the organizations. Why does it matter, I suppose, is a key question here. And it matters, I think, because diversity is important. You know, criticality matters. We need to harness the expertise in the system. If we go with the flow and we don't critique, we end up with bland, conformist policy, and we're letting down the people who really matter, who are the young people in our classrooms and schools. So what I'm arguing for here is a more inclusive approach rather than the exclusionary approach that values the voices of particular people in the system, something that values voices across the system, even when those voices are critical and dissenting. And this is about, I think, working with people to develop understandings, shared understandings. One of the strengths, I think, of the Finnish system, and it's often touted as being the best thing in the world, of course, but there are strengths there, and one of them is actually that there is an effort put into, with new policy, developing shared understanding of what's happening with the new policy, what's different about it, what needs to change. And that can only happen through dialogue, and that dialogue will surface uncomfortable tensions, of course, and that's a good thing. And this is about building capacity, of course, across the system. And the parachute picture there, I think, is quite apt because it demonstrates that actually curriculum change is complex, it's high risk, but we need to work together to get it right. So what we're seeing, of course, is in policy and discourse that influences policy, I think, is a homogenization in many respects. So transnational organizations like the OECD, very influential here. A couple of quotations I've just put up on here from Zhongyi Deng. You know, this is part of a move to bypass formalized curriculum making, to produce a teacher-proof curriculum, but based around not educational but economical concepts. And the notion that curriculum has become very much something about social efficiency, that it's about producing particular types of people, as Biester says here, that people are becoming objects of intervention to meet some social need rather than subjects in their own right. And we're losing something fundamentally in education if we see it that way. So this homogenization is evident in curriculum policy. We did a recent study for the UNESCO, which suggested that there are common trends across the world. You know, the emergence of very similar discourses and terminology between contexts, a shared emphasis that education is a response to global and local challenges. In other words, it's often this heavy social efficiency element, and a belief that education is a means through which individuals can contribute to society. And that's redolent in the curriculum for excellence with, you know, the competencies around effective contributors and responsible citizens and so on. And what's missing, I think, is this idea of education as personal growth, which is so important. We did see some key distinctions across the globe, of course. This isn't a uniform process of homogenization. We saw, for example, that often different countries had very different conceptions of what these concepts were. And this really does raise for me the notion that we do need to have dialogue about this. We can't just use them as slogans. We have to make sense of what these big concepts are. And also that different countries have different core values. So often what we see with the homogenized curriculum is a framework of a discursive framework superimposed on top of practices and beliefs and values that exist already. One of the trends that we are seeing here is a shift from input regulation in terms of curriculum to output regulation, and that's really occurred in the last 20 years or so. So we've seen a move away from tight specification of what is to be taught, the input, the archetypal teacher-proof curriculum, to something that's a lot more subtle, where the regulation is through measurement, it's through audit, it's through looking at what is produced from education. And we're seeing, for example, the development of huge frameworks of competencies which can be ticked off. And these produce this bland homogenization. And Biester's argued that, in fact, this output steering is even more pernicious in eroding teacher autonomy than the so-called teacher-proof curriculum that preceded it. Here's an example of what this might look like. So the Scottish Curriculum for Excellence is framed around about 1,800 learning outcomes and around 3,000 or 4,000 what are called assessment benchmarks. Now, these lend themselves, of course, to spreadsheet approaches to curriculum. You simply audit your existing practice against what it is that's in these benchmarks, and then you tweak accordingly. And that is not a holistic, coherent approach to curriculum making, of course. So we do have in these curricula a rhetoric of learner-centeredness, but really the focus is on social efficiency. The methodology is a methodology of measurement and audit, and that leads itself to performativity. And we see in here a downgrading of knowledge as well. So what we do see, if knowledge is not talked about as something important here, is that we see a lot of local variation, which is not driven by educational ideas, but driven by instrumental purposes. For example, it's been tested next year, or we have the textbooks, etc. So the Scottish Curriculum for Excellence is, as I said, a good example. It's been around for about 20 years now, and it does provide actually increasing amounts of empirical evidence about how this sort of very technical, rational curriculum framework pans out in practice as it's enacted in schools. So just a few features and consequences here. What we're seeing is, the framing of the curriculum around these thousands of statements. We see the collection of national assessment data, which is measured against these statements. We see a focus on attainment in the senior phase, so that's drawn from qualifications data as a measure of quality of secondary schools, and this very high profile of attainment in another feature of output regulation, inspections of schools. And what we've seen empirically happening here, and we finished a big project last year on this, in secondary schools at least, but we're also seeing in primary schools, is a narrowing of the curriculum. So in primary schools, where the focus is on testing literacy and numeracy, we're seeing the virtual disappearance, in the words of one primary teacher, of the expressive arts and integrated approaches. Children are being exposed to a diet daily of English, maths, and then something like the Daily Mile for their health and well-being. And that is not a balanced curriculum. It's also, I would argue, a very destructive and boring curriculum for young people. So we're also seeing curriculum narrowing in the senior phase. And this is particularly evident in schools serving disadvantaged areas. We're seeing the approach of a very formulaic teach-to-the-test methodology, what's called the two-term dash, where we cram as much content in as possible and coach students how to pass exams, because that is what the school is measured on. And significant backwash on the senior phase, on the earlier years of secondary education, where in the broad general education phase, where it's basically seen as a dress rehearsal for the important exam phase to come. So these are very consequential things that are happening as a result of the focus on attainment in the Scottish system. I just want to highlight a couple of things from the report we did, and then I'm going to move on to talk about curriculum making. So this is a secondary school. Head teacher was quite honest about this. The results were poor year on year. The kids were failing, so I just cut the subject from the curriculum altogether. I got rid of technology in the senior phase, not needed. We see practices and these wonderful euphemisms here: assertive coursing, farming. This is the practice of steering or obliging young people to take subjects where they're seen to have a better chance of success. So this is not at all about what people want to do. It's about the attainment of the school, and this is the performative culture we're seeing in spades here. Allied with that, there's this culture of compliance, and the inspectors are very important in this quotation here. I was instructed I should be doing things in a certain way because the inspectors would want to see that. These are not educational rationales for doing things. They're about audit, they're about performance, they're about image, they're about the statistics that the school can produce to show that it is a successful school. Now, what I want to do now is to move on to have a look at some ideas which have come out of our recent work, and this book particularly, around curriculum making and thinking about curriculum much more holistically, both as something that is driven by purpose and something that is driven across a system. So we're actually thinking systemically about how curriculum is made, how it is practiced. And it's important, I think, here to just clarify a couple of points, because some of this is maybe counterintuitive. It certainly offers perhaps different ways of looking at curriculum. The first one here, which I think is nicely summed up by this quote by Michael Connolly, just to say that actually curriculum is a complex system involving teachers, students, curricular content, social settings, and all manner of impinging matters ranging from the local to the international. It's a system which we need to understand systemically. We need to understand how it works together. And that's quite a different thing to saying, how well are people doing? We need to understand what we need to do in order to produce good attainment or good achievement or good education, rather than simply measuring it at the top end. This is about a change of emphasis from outputs and back to inputs, I think. And it's understanding as well that curriculum is a highly complex web of enactment. I'm going to offer a different view of curriculum as well here, which some of you may not be familiar with. It is traditional, I think, in schools to see curriculum as the syllabus, as the content. The Curriculum for Excellence tried to adopt a more holistic view. Curriculum is everything that happens in schools, which is actually quite unhelpful as well because it's vague. So this definition here, which is curriculum as the multi-layered social practices through which education is structured, enacted, and evaluated, allows us to start to drill down into what those practices are. There are at least 3 dimensions of this here. The first one is this idea that curriculum is something that we do. It's not an artifact, although artifacts are part of the curriculum, but it's something that we do, or precisely something that is made by practitioners and other actors, and that could include young people and community actors as well, working with each other. Then the second one here is that it happens across multiple layers or sites of an education system, and I want to go down in a couple of slides' time. I'll give some more detail about that. And these include, for example, schools and district offices, policy-making arenas, national agencies, etc. And these different things happen in different ways, and they need to articulate together. And then, finally, the curriculum is something that involves multiple practices. We cannot understand, we cannot plan meaningfully, I think, what we teach unless we also understand how we teach it, how we organize it, how we evaluate it, etc., how we support the development of it. All of these are activities which I would argue are part of curriculum making. So to move on here, the big question then I'm going to ask here is, in relation to the theme of the conference, is how does the system, the education system, support meaningful curriculum making, okay? And this is a different question, quite a different question, to how effective is what we're doing, because the first one is about inputs, as I said, and the second one is about measurement, and they have quite different consequences. So this is not then about what we currently have, which is schools, teachers, and students jumping to the often arbitrary demands of the system. It is about developing the conditions where successful, effective curriculum making can happen and where educational practices become coherent, progressive, purposeful, etc. So curriculum making has a long history. I'm going back here to the 1970s. I just want to highlight a couple of ideas here. There were some ideas came out of predominantly the United States around curriculum making as occurring across levels. So writers like Walter Doyle, for example, talked about curriculum as being societal, the abstract ideas about what matter at the top. The institutional, the way in which we translate those ideas into meaningful policy frameworks, textbooks, etc. And then the instructional, what's happening in the school or college level. Now, the critique of that was quite considerable. I mean, this is a good attempt to start to explore heuristically how curriculum is made across the system, but it was seen as hierarchical, perhaps a little normative. I think it's insufficiently granular because there are things happening which aren't captured by this, and it does tend to focus on institutional levels. Government makes curriculum policy, schools do curriculum, etc. So I want to offer another approach, and this is an approach which was developed by the SLO, which is the Dutch National Curriculum Agency, a few years ago. And this, I think, is more helpful in some ways because it's more granular. It identifies the supra, the international, the macro, the policy system level, the meso, which they've identified as the school level, the micro, the classroom, and the nano, the individual, the pupil. Again, I think this is helpful, and it certainly inspired us in our work, but because it's more granular. But I think one of the problems with this is that it does tend to focus, again, on the institutional levels. It's easy to start to reify these practices here as things happening in particular institutions, government, agency, school, etc. So working with this, we've developed a different approach here, which isn't focused on institutional levels, it's focused on types of activity. So what we're trying to do here is to identify the different types of activity that are necessary if we develop curriculum as a set of social practices. So supra then is about the discourses, the discursive emergence that happens as ideas are bounced around. Macro is about creating the frameworks, which may happen, and often does happen at a government level, but can happen locally, of course. Meso is an interesting one. I want to come back to that in a little bit more detail, because meso is about the production of, it's essentially the layer that connects policy and practice, or ideas and practice. It's about how we enable the system to start to make sense of and enact curriculum. So that could include things like guidance, but actually I would argue that activity is often better. Teacher networking, collaborative networking, curriculum leadership, etc. And then the micro, this whole school level, and this is different, of course, because the SLO framework used the term meso for that. And then the nano is what Walter Doyle called curriculum events. It's the day-to-day interactions, the transactions that happen in classrooms. Now, we think that this offers a different approach because while it keeps the granularity of Tyson van den Akker's framework, it recognizes that these are different types of activity, that curriculum is social practice, and that actors actually can move across these different layers. So an example of that would be in the Welsh curriculum, where teachers were working as classroom teachers, they were supporting colleagues in their own schools, they were working regionally in networks to support colleagues across clusters of schools, and they were involved in writing national curriculum policy. And that was actually a very good curriculum making activity because it helped develop capacity across the Welsh system. So what I want to do is just drill down briefly into some of these. At the macro level, of course, there is a clear responsibility for governments to get the technical stuff right, and that means identifying clear sets of curricular purposes at a high level. It means identifying where there are tensions between policies, where, for example, does your accountability policy undermine your curriculum policy. And it's also about getting the right technical form, and this is an area where I think there needs to be an awful lot more research. I'm quite attracted, but without a great deal of work done in this area, to the idea of big ideas as a formation, as a foundation for curriculum policy, rather than the notion of the learning outcome and the frames which have layers of hierarchical levels. Because what we've seen with the latter, of course, is this audit approach, the spreadsheet approach to curriculum making. But I think it's also incumbent on government to create the infrastructure to enable the diverse voices in the system to come to the fore. So that means creating, for example, appropriate spaces to bring together teachers and other stakeholders here to work with policy making. And there is some evidence around the world that this happens. So the national conversation was one attempt to do it. I don't think, well, the jury's out on that because we're still working with it. There was some research in Finland that suggested that this, what was called deliberative crowdsourcing, which develop some of the ideas for the new national curriculum wasn't as effective as it might have been, but it had potential to do so because it still silenced some voices here. I would argue that this is a case of balance. If we overemphasize any of these, we end up, I think, with a curriculum that's potentially unworkable. We have, in many countries now, an overemphasis on the bureaucratic expertise, the production of highly technical frameworks without thinking about how they're enacted in schools. In some countries now, we're handing things back to teachers. The Netherlands, for example, is a country where there's a big emphasis on improving teacher autonomy. And I think some of the early experiences of that, going back 5-6 years now, are actually that teachers need support to do it. It's not something they can do on their own. So if we're only working on practical expertise, we end up with something that's perhaps impoverished as well. And then theoretical expertise, the expertise that's brought by curriculum scholars, for example, or people who have technical expertise in curriculum in national agencies. I think there has to be a combination of all of those, and that can only be achieved through a deliberate process of dialogue where the spaces are set up and where we do explore not only the commonalities, but we explore constructively the differences in these diverse voices. The meso layer I want to say a little bit more about because I think this is highly significant. The research that we highlighted in our book, Curriculum Making in Europe, suggested that this perhaps is the most significant type of curriculum making for supporting practice in schools. And there are various examples of this in the book. For example, in Republic of Cyprus, the emergence of a type of expert teacher called a subject counsellor. In the Republic of Ireland, the emergence of teams called Junior Cycle for Teachers, for example, which supported curriculum development in schools. So we've got specialist teachers who work with schools directly. But some interesting questions here, because this is often a black box. We sort of assume we produce policy and then people will get on and do it. But what's happening in between? Is it planned? Is it deliberative? Is it understood by people in the system? Is it properly resourced? And in many systems it isn't. And importantly, which people are involved? And significantly, who are we excluding, of course? So I would argue here that we need to do more around this meso layer to connect policy and practice. And this schematic here, I think, tries to illustrate that. If we have a policy which is primarily top-down, and this is often presented as a dichotomy, top-down or bottom-up, I think that's misleading. But if it's primarily top-down, do we get a lack of ownership? If it's primarily bottom-up, do we get a lack of direction? So this, again, is an argument for working systemically as we develop the curriculum. It's about thinking about what infrastructure we need in the central bubble here. It's how the agencies are involved. It's about how researchers are involved. It's about how we involve teachers. And I would say that any system is going to be strengthened if classroom teachers are involved outside of their own schools in teacher networks, for example, to develop the curriculum, to produce resources, etc. So this is really about this idea of how do we fill that black box that connects policy, practice, or ideas and practice as well, of course. And it's about getting the right sort of diversity, of course. We can see quite significant diversity between schools in unstructured systems where we get high levels of variation which have significant equity issues between schools. But, this is about, I suppose, getting the balance right. It's about addressing the tensions and conflicts and treating them as something that's positive. It's about avoiding these inequitable levels of variation. So we need to, and I think this is a nice quote from Mary James here, recognize that there is an intrinsic worth of disciplinary knowledge here, while at the same time recognizing the provisionality of knowledge, and that actually, I suppose this is to some extent about how we get the balance right between the disciplinary bodies of knowledge and the local funds of knowledge that people bring. And that's often a pedagogical question, of course. So this is about unlocking and building the diverse capacity of the system. It's about listening to people. And it's about really getting the system to a place where it is adequately and progressively supporting the development of practice in these nano sites, the classrooms, that is purposeful, coherent, and ensures progression. I just want to quickly acknowledge here that these are often quite old ideas here. Schwab, writing in the 60s and 70s, talked about commonplaces. These commonplaces here, the teachers who bring practical knowledge, the curriculum which brings the agreed purposes and ideas and core concepts that we need to cover. The conditions, we need to get the conditions right where people can work constructively in schools to make the curriculum. And a curriculum that also acknowledges that students are different in different contexts and that we need to be culturally responsive here. So, and of course, the curriculum expertise is something that's needed to weave these four commonplaces together. Too often, what we see in terms of curriculum making looks a little bit like that. Government produces product. Teachers say, not quite sure what this is, but we'll shove it in any old way anyway and see how it goes. No matter, the principal says we had no choice. So, how do we avoid that? Or perhaps a more nuanced version here, and I do want to acknowledge my friend Daniel Alvanger, who had to go back to Sweden today. This is his cartoon. The new curriculum is the snake. The old curriculum is the elephant. Along comes a new curriculum. What we see is a change of terminology and a change of paperwork, but are we seeing fundamental changes to the practice? And this isn't just about going uncritically and implementing new policy. It's about how we engage with education ideas about what it means to be educated, and using the curriculum which has been produced as a framework to enable us to do that, a framework of ideas and resources. In all of this, and I'm now talking explicitly about the micro and what's happening in schools, but also the need for a meso sort of level of support here, we need process. We need to work from purposes. I'm very clear about that in the work we've been doing. But we also need to have clear processes for people to engage with purposes and to develop practices. And critical collaborative professional inquiry is an approach which my colleague Valerie Drew and I have used in Scotland now and in Wales for about 12 years. Working with lots of teachers. We've worked with hundreds of teachers on this, and it works because what it does is it takes people from the starting point of what are we trying to achieve here, the big ideas, and working through a systematic process, an action research-based process, and getting to a point where we've developed some practice, at which point we evaluate it and the cycle can continue. And some of the schools we've worked with in Scotland have actually been very successful working with this. There's at least 2 schools have won awards on the back of this. Now, I'm not claiming the credit for the awards at all. All we've done is put in place a process. The credit has come from the way in which these processes have enabled teachers with diverse views and backgrounds to work together to develop some sort of common purpose and common practices. And that's, I think, really important. Some of the work we've done to evaluate this, one of the interesting things is that critical collaborative professional inquiry seems to have an effect on enhancing teachers' professional agency. And just a few things here that came out very clearly from the research: enhance professional knowledge, change dispositions to practice, increase professional confidence, more expansive and varied aspirations. People stop seeing the blinkered approach where they can only see what's ahead of them, but start to say, well, we could do it differently. And we can start to acknowledge that this person has a different perspective, and how do we build that into what we do? In terms of the cultural structural domains around agency, we saw a breakdown of hierarchies, which was quite significant. We had head teachers working with probationer teachers to develop the curriculum in these schools. We saw people reporting that what was currently, well, for many schools, very risky behavior, innovation, actually became less risky because there was this sense of mutual support here. And significantly as well, the teachers reported enhanced relational resources. They had wider networks. They were able to access a wider range of ideas to inform their practice. And what we've seen in some of the schools, and it's early days yet, of course, is sustainable engagement over time with curriculum policy and with educational ideas, and emerging changes to school practices. And that paper was written in 2019. So it'd be interesting to go back and do some more research in those schools. So to summarize, and I'm just about bang on time, I think, here, what I'd like to see in order to enhance the diversity of voices in the system is policy development which is more focused on involving teachers. And that happens in some systems, of course. I'd also like to see more account taken of independent research in this. I'd like to see infrastructure developed, for example, funded teacher networks. One way of doing this is to second teachers part-time into regional organisations or national organisations, but keep them in school as well. Don't just take them out and put them into a different organisation and expect them to thrive. Keep them in touch with schools. The meso level then, this is about changing the focus away from this idea of measurement towards input and support. It's about developing professional networks, as I said, and it's about thinking about resource production. One of the sort of bugbears of mine around modern curricula is that schools are expected just to get on and produce their stuff, and a lot of them spend a lot of time reinventing the wheel. So it's really important that we think about how the system can support that and how we can collectively produce resources. And then at the micro level, getting the right sort of diversity, utilising the strength of the system is good on one hand, but if we're going to end up with lots of variation across schools, it's inequitable, and particularly if it harms young people with, coming from more disadvantaged backgrounds, then we're not succeeding. And I think the key to this is building teacher agency. And a recent publication that Stav Ruler, Daniel, Tina and I have written is exploring the relationship between teacher agency and curriculum making. They're mutually constitutive concepts. People develop better agency through getting involved in curriculum making. And good agency is necessary for curriculum making. And this is not a new insight. Lawrence Stenhouse talked about this in the 70s. You know, there can be no teacher development no curriculum development without teacher development. So, to finish off, what I'm looking for here is a balancing act, a top-down and bottom-up approaches, a balancing act between central specification and flexibility locally, trust and risk management. I want to see a bigger emphasis on curricular purposes, but at the same time we need to balance that against the cultural responsiveness, and a system that draws in lots of different types of expertise. So, and a couple of just points to finish off. Above all, a system that values and celebrates diverse voices as a source of strength and richness, rather than seeing them as a threat. And as cited by Lumbey in English, writing a few years ago now, education is not about silencing or eradicating the opposition, but of using differences and even resistance to advance more viable and inclusive practices and perspectives. And I thought that finished it off very nicely. Now, while I have a captive audience here, I'd also like, oops, it's not there. Right, well, forget that. I was going to advertise our new curriculum centre. There are a few flyers around. We've got a launch event on the 19th of September. For some reason, I seem to have ended up with an old version of this presentation that doesn't have that slide, so apologies there. If anyone's interested in that, please do email me. My contact details are here, and thank you very much for listening.